So I have processed my sprouted wheat, and it's 1.5 cups of those sprouts. So if I were going to make that in my jar, we'll just go over the sprouting process. And then I'm going to have to make another loaf of bread. So you may get a delivery, Elizabeth. So we've got, Elizabeth just is right around the corner, so it's very easy. 1. This is 1/2 cup. This is another 1/2 cup. And this is another 1/2. So 1.5 cups. And you could see that I wasn't being super precise. That's the other thing I really like about this recipe. It's going to work, like, even if the measurements aren't exact. So that's, we're finished with our wheat here. And then to sprout it, you're going to use filtered water. That's the other really important point for making sourdough starter. You cannot use chlorinated water. So the chemicals, chlorine in our water is going to kill off the healthy bacteria just like it kills it off in our gut, right? So we want to get the purest water that we can. Now, have people made a sourdough starter with just from water and flour? You know, perhaps from tap water, perhaps it's possible. It's less likely it's going to work. So, and why would you want that in your sourdough starter if you're trying to make something healthy for your gut? So, this I would leave for 8 to 12 hours. So if I start this is not a great time to start it because it's noon, which means it's going to be ready to dump the water out at midnight, which I'm not going to be up. But I'm going to I'll just drain it before I go to bed at 10 o'clock. That's good enough. And then after I drain it, I've got this little setup that works for me. You can also get a regular jar with a lid, one of those canning lids, and instead of, and I used to have one of these but I don't anymore, and instead of putting that metal piece in, yeah, so instead of this, and I will probably make these for you guys when I get out to Michael's, and what you get is those mesh, one of those pieces of mesh plastic that people use for
needlework.
Needlework,
Oh.
yeah. And cut it to that shape. And then you can just dump it really easily. So that's usually how I would make my sprouts. But since I don't have that available right now, and I didn't get to the store to be able to do that, to make those, once I strain the water out, so say this has been sitting for 8 to 12 hours, then I'll just let it drain like this. And then several times a day, if you're working, once in the morning, once when you come home, and once at night is good. If you miss one, just do it twice a day. You're going to want to put more filtered water in here. And you're going to give them a little stir, and then rinse it. Okay, because you want to keep them damp so that they sprout. You don't want them sitting in water for too long just to get it started. That softens the shell, and then you're just keeping them damp until you see those little white bits growing. So if I'm making this bread and my starter's in the fridge, I'm going to take my starter out the same day that I get my wheat sprouting. And I'm going to feed my starter right away, and then I'm probably going to feed it again. And I'll just keep feeding it until this is ready to go, and then I'm ready to make my my bread. Now I'm just going to leave this like this because it needs to sit for 8 to 12 hours. Good. And then once you have them and they're sprouted, you're going to put them in your food processor, or if you don't have a food processor, you're looking at a mortar and pestle. Right? So, or a blender. This will work fine in a blender as well. It actually works quite well in a blender. And you're going to let those blend until they're nice and watery. Okay. So let's see, how's this doing? That's pretty good. Now, because these were so sprouted, they're a little drier than sometimes it will be. But this is going to work too. So again, this recipe is hugely, hugely forgiving. And we know that when we sprout grains, that the nutritional value is increased exponentially. And I actually have the amounts here. And you will want to clean things sooner than later because, again, it's like glue. So when we sprout the wheat, what happens? The other thing about sourdough bread is that it has leptins in it. And leptins are the thing in fiber that makes us feel full. So you're not going to eat as much of this bread. And actually, I was amazed the first time. I used to hear these stories about farmers who would eat bread, have a piece of bread and tea, and go out and work in the fields for 4 or 5 hours the rest of the day, right? And I would think, how would a piece of bread and some tea or a piece of bread and whatever, how is that going to keep you going for 4 or 5 hours? This bread will keep you going for 4 to 5 hours. Easy, one piece. It's like so nutritionally dense. Yeah, so sprouting. The germination enhances the availability of A, B, and C vitamins. So all your B vitamins, your C vitamins, and vitamin A that are in your grain. It releases the elements iron, potassium, and calcium, makes it more available to us. And it markedly elevates protein levels. So you're getting such a big difference in nutrition here. And after 3 days, when you let this sit until it's ready to, and actually it's the 3 days of the sprouting, those vitamin contents have increased from 300 to 600%. So this recipe I'm showing you is a real keeper. And sprouts enzymes also help to break down gluten. So again, we're making it even more digestible by using the sprouts. Yeah, great for pregnant women. My daughter will be getting a loaf of this very soon. Okay, so we've got our sprouted wheat in there, and to that we're going to add half a cup of our sourdough starter. Well, this is half a cup right here. Yeah, I'm going to use this one because it's got more bubbles. But I have used not a very vigorous sourdough starter with this bread before, and it still did fine. It's one happening loaf of bread. And you can tell that because we've got all these other good things in there. And we're not done yet. Okay, there's our sourdough starter. And they're just everywhere. You do get, once you start making bread with this, you do get a little attached to your sourdough. You want it, people name them. You know, this is Boris, my starter, and it's very cute. Okay, I'm just trying to keep some space here available. Now, the other thing we're going to add to this, which is really going to boost nutrition, and nobody's going to know it's in there, and it's going to be so good for you, is we're going to add some sea vegetables. So this is aramay, and we're going to grind this up. When I was doing macrobiotics, we would be eating sea vegetables every day, which is how I grew back my thyroid, right? Very good for the thyroid gland. Lots of trace minerals that we don't get these days in our diets. This is a Vata memory. So I learn really quickly and I forget very quickly. This is why I consult notes and why I teach too, because it helps me remember things. But the benefits of seaweed, it's got the broadest range of minerals of any food. B vitamins, folate, riboflavin, iron, calcium, lignans, again, which make us feel full. 60 times more potent than land veggies. Good source of iodine for healthy thyroid function, helps with cancer protection. They use that in Japan after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, another bright point in our human history, dear God. Reduces high blood pressure, helps prevent heart disease, helps reduce affective stress. Now, so it's good for the adrenals. Now, Ayurvedically, we would say this is very cooling, so it's very anti-inflammatory. Anything from the sea is going to be cooling, right? So we want to process this just by horrible sound, but it works. Now you make that a little finer. It tends to just fly up in the thing, so. The machine gets so loud because it feels like it's got nothing in there. But you can see it's just all ground up nicely. Mm-hmm. And you don't want more than about 1/4 of a cup. This is half a cup, so I don't, yeah, this is a little less than 1/4 of a cup, so that's okay. If you go over 1/4 of a cup, people are going to taste it. And if you're cooking for kids, they probably, not many people in our culture have a taste for sea vegetables. Certainly during my macrobiotic times, I got a taste for sea vegetables. I would soak this and then quickly saute it with some onions and tamari and maybe a bit of mirin or something, and you'd have a little bit on the side of your meal. So that's how that would work. This is from a health food store. Pricey, $6.75 for this. But you can get it in the Asian food marts for a big bag for a lot less. You may not know where it's coming from. You don't want to eat any sea vegetables coming from Japan. That after Fukushima, it's the whole. They're recommending people don't even eat fish there anymore. So. Okay. And then we want to give the buglets something to eat, and they love sweet. And the sweet we're going to use, we might as well use something that also is going to help us out, is molasses. So blackstrap molasses, organic molasses, this is going to again, add more iron. There's lots of good stuff in your molasses, and it's going to give the bacteria something to eat to help it rise. And we want about a teaspoon. And again, I'm not going to measure. I'm just going to pour in what looks to be like a teaspoon. If it's a little bit more, it's okay. And you can taste the iron in here. Wow, that's really, so this is an extremely healthy bread. And then we want 2 teaspoons of salt in here. And I will measure that. I could use my hand too. I'm getting pretty good at that, but. And I'm going to use my Himalayan sea salt. So if you want to get good at measuring by hand, what you do, you got your teaspoon there, you put it in your palm. Okay, that's a teaspoon, right? Just make sure yep, teaspoon. And then after a while, you just go, yeah, it's a teaspoon. And it impresses people. So it's not It's a pretty good thing to learn. Okay, and then, do I need that anymore? Okay, 2.5 cups of flour. So before you put your flour in, you want to mix all this up, because if you don't, it's not going to be even in your... You got to always mix your wet ingredients together first before you add your dry. And that's pretty common for all baking. All right. And 2.5 cups. So I'm going to start with 2 cups, and we'll leave the other half of a cup to add if it seems to need more. Okay, so that's 1 cup. Two cups. And because that mix of sprouts was kind of dry, because it had sprouted for so long, I'm thinking I'm going to get away with these 2 cups of flour. Now this is not a kneaded bread. You're not going to knead this. You're just going to mix it up, and you can't over mix it. It's not one of those things where, oh, if I mix it too much, it's going to be hard and I'm going to use my hands here now. Oh, this is pretty wet. I might need more. So it's like a shaggy dough by the time it's done. Kind of a ball, but not really. If you make it more on the wet side, it's just going to take a little more time to cook, probably. And this has stuck to my hands like crazy. So if it's really sticking to your hands like that, even though you've put flour on them before you started, it needs some more flour. Elizabeth, would you mind grabbing a 1/2 cup in there? And that's good enough. And 1/2 of that, maybe. That's good. Yeah, so I want it to kind of form a shaggy ball. And this is not kneading. This is just mixing. You could possibly do this in a food processor or something, but I've never tried that. I've just always done it like this. Thank you.
In the KitchenAid mixer, don't we have the dough hook?
If you have a dough hook with a KitchenAid mixer, for sure you can do this. And there are sourdough recipes that will use a KitchenAid mixer like that. Yeah. So this is pretty good. There's some flour on the bottom there, but I'm not going to worry about that. As long as I'm getting my little ball of dough here. This would be you could probably start to knead this. It's getting close to being kneadable, actually, so it definitely has enough flour in it. You want to be careful about how much flour and water you put down your sink. So when you're discarding your sourdough starter, if you're not going to use it to make pancakes or muffins or something, or chocolate cake. One of the before this course is over, we're going to make a sourdough chocolate cake. It's the best I've ever tasted. Honestly, it's so good. What was I saying?
In the sink.
Oh yeah, if you wash it, you can clog up your sink. So your sourdough starter should go in your compost. If you don't have a compost, maybe in a bit of paper towel or something in your garbage. Best to give it to a friend and teach them how to do this. That's what I would do. Okay, so we're done with our flour. I can put that away. Now, because I'm going to show you a variation on this loaf, because I've already made the loaf that we're going to have today with our soup. If you add, you can make a nice breakfast loaf that's a little bit sweet if you add some dates to it. So we're going to do that with this loaf, so I don't have 2 of the same. And one. I used to make one. One would be for breakfast, and one would be for later in the day with some soup or something, right? But I quite like the date loaf. Now, a good way, I'm going to, you need to oil your pan, and ghee is a wonderful thing, or butter you can use. This will be cooked at 350, so the olive oil will still be stable at that heat. And just because it's easy, I'm going to use the olive oil right now. But if I had ghee, I would probably use ghee. I'm out right now. I need to make some. But this is fine. If you want a foolproof way of getting the bread out of your pan, and I've not had much of a problem with this bread, to be quite honest, but say you've got an old pan, you're a little worried about it sticking, just cut a piece of parchment paper. And this will actually help to lift the loaf out very easily too. And you can just line the bottom, and then what I will do is just go along the sides with a knife before I lift it out. It comes out very, very easily. Oh, I forgot the other thing. The other thing you can add to this is like half a cup of sunflower seeds or pumpkin seeds. So in this loaf that we're going to eat, it has half a cup of pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds. And as it sits and ferments, all seeds should be sprouted, right, when we eat them, because it increases the availability of nutrients and also makes them more digestible, right? So you'll see in the health foods section where they'll have sprouted seeds and things like that. So I could have put up to a half a cup of seeds in here. Now I'm going to use the dates, so if I had remembered I would. I could probably still mix it in so they're pretty much mixed in, but usually I would put that in with the wet ingredients and then put my flour in so it was thoroughly mixed through. So we'll just go with the dates for now. And the reason I don't put the dates in and mix them up is because they'll get crushed and disintegrate a little bit. So I'm going to push them into the dough once I get the loaf formed here. So basically you're just pushing it in, making sure that it's kind of evenly level. And honestly, this really doesn't care how much you handle it. I have abused a loaf before, squishing things in and trying stuff, and it really does not mind. So now you can spend money on regular dates, and I do, but I was also in the Indian food store, and they have a whole pressed thing of dates. So this is just pure dates.
Wow.
Oh yeah, for like under $4. It was like $3 something. And used more for baking and places where your dates are going to be crushed anyway. And they make lots of stuff with dates, so I'm just going to make date-like pieces. And that's probably too much that I've cut. But we'd say that's kind of like a date. I could make them smaller and have more bits in it. Maybe I will. So that's a nice thing about these pressed dates, is that you can kind of decide how big your dates are. And then I just push them right into the dough, kind of evenly. And I'm going to push them in more in a minute once I get them all kind of decided where I want them. I love dates. This is going to make a nice sweet loaf for the morning. Yeah, sure, why not? So then I'm going to press it in and kind of put the dough around it so it covers it. And that way the dates are going to stay you're going to bite into the bread and all of a sudden there'll be this real sweetness, and then so you get sweet and sour with this, right? Now the bacteria likes warmth, so again we want to put this loaf somewhere where it's fairly warm so it will rise easily. Now the days that I didn't have the heat on in the apartment, so there's the finished product there. The days I didn't have the heat on in the apartment, I don't have a light in that little oven. So I rigged up a night light with one of the old bulbs, not an LED bulb, so that it gives off a bit of heat. And I put the night light with an extension cord into my little oven and put this in here, covered with a tea towel. So you want to keep the top from drying out. And I have a clean towel here. Then you just put the tea towel over top and put it in a warm place. If I were working on my computer, my big computer, it gets really quite toasty warm between the computer and the wall. I would put it there. Also, when the heat comes on by my feet where the printer is, it's very warm there too. So that would be another great place to let this rise. It's not going to rise like this. It's going to come up maybe to the top. Maybe it'll be a little bit bounded like this, rounded at the top, and then once you cook it, it's going to rise up a little bit more. So it doesn't have a huge rise to it. It's not that kind of bread. It's a pretty dense bread.
So you can't put it on, say, a windowsill to...
If it was hot in the summer,
Yeah.
you could. In the wintertime,
No.
not unless you're getting a lot of warm sun through that window and it feels warm. So my window here is west facing, so it would maybe be okay later in the afternoon when the sun's coming in, but I wouldn't want it there the whole time. So if it's the winter time and your place is cool, you may want to think about I've put it near a heat register before in my other place that I lived, because now when I lived in that apartment, after I left the house, I lived in that apartment on Pall Mall that was like 80 degrees in the winter time. Boom, this would be ready to cook in like 6 hours easy. So you're going to let this sit anywhere from 6, 8, 12 hours. So it's going to depend, the variation will depend on how warm your place is. But as soon as you see it around level with your tin, you're going to be ready to go. And I used to have a glass Pyrex dish, and I prefer those actually over these, God knows what's in these non-stick things. So whenever I go to Value Village or I'm looking for one of those, it unfortunately it shattered one time. But so I will just leave this probably in my warmest spot, which is, and then, okay, so it's 1 o'clock now. Probably by 7 o'clock tonight, that's going to be ready to put in the oven. And then it's going to go in the oven from anywhere to 45 to 55 minutes, or until the internal temperature is 200 degrees. So if you can see in this loaf where I've stuck my handy, is this the right one? Yep. So, I'd stick that in. Oh, it's not quite 200. I put it back in for another 5-10 minutes. It'll be fine. It's also this loaf is also very forgiving in terms of the cooking. I've never burnt one of these, so it has a bit of leeway there. If you leave it a little longer, it might just be a little crustier.
So what temperature?
It's at 350.
Oh.
Yeah, that'll be in your notes and on your recipe, but it's 350.
So is it preheated oven?
Preheated oven for sure. So that's basically the bread. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And you can also make this bread without the sprouted wheat, and I'll give you that recipe. So if you want a lighter loaf that's a little more, this is really not a sandwich bread. You wouldn't want to take two pieces, and I've known people who've done this, and then they go, oh my God, that's really heavy. Well, yeah, it's really heavy. So it's more of a, you could do an open face kind of thing. I mean, sandwiches are notoriously hard to digest anyway. You're putting a bunch of grain with God knows what else, usually some luncheon meat and cheese and whatever. But I've had a slice of that with some hummus and some sprouts and a bit of fermented vegetables on the side, and it's been a lovely lunch. So it's really, once you have your loaf, it's so easy and quick to be able to just grab a piece, and you really are good to go for many, many hours. I made a loaf of this for my friends Betty and Andrew, and they took it canoeing with them. And I made one with the dates in it, so it was a little bit sweet. And they said they had a piece of that for breakfast, and they could not believe how long they went before they were hungry. So this is what we were meant to eat. This is real bread. This is not. And then, of course, we can get into the lovely, more European loaves. And they're usually, you can cook those nicely at home in a Dutch oven. So we'll probably do that at some point too, and a bit later. But for today, this is a really good one to start with because you're going to have success, right?
Mm-hmm. So can you use like different types of grains with that?
You can, if you have a gluten sensitivity, you can make a spelt. I should have taken this out earlier too to warm up. You can make a spelt starter. So you're going to do the same process with the pineapple juice, only using spelt flour. You can make a rye starter. So whatever kind of bread you want to make, say you want to make a rye bread, you should probably make a rye starter for that rye bread. And so rye is going to be a denser loaf than wheat, and it's going to be a more sour starter usually. Rye has a much stronger kind of flavor than wheat does. So definitely you can use different grains, and the spelt, I haven't experimented a whole lot with spelt. So that's the next thing I'll do is get a spelt starter going and get a couple recipes for spelt based bread, and see if we can get one that's really easy to make for people to do who have that kind of gluten sensitivity at the moment. Hopefully, over time, you build up the health of your gut and you're able to eat this quite easily, right? That's the whole goal. It's not to start taking this, that, and the other thing out of the diet. You may have to do that for a short period while you're healing, but you want to be able to build up the strength of your digestion so you can start to eat things that are good for you, but are just require a healthy digestion. I have never had any kind of gas or bloating after eating this bread at all. So I actually usually feel quite good. So I've been looking forward to getting back into it in the fall. I have bought a few loaves of the European sourdough bread over the summer, which was really lovely. But we shouldn't be eating too much wheat during the summer. We should be eating a lot less wheat than we do. It's seasonal. Again, this is winter food. This is hearty winter food. Now, I do want to just thicken this soup a little bit. And since you guys are used to ghee, I am going to use a roux, which will make this not vegan after I use the roux, which is just flour and fat, right? So if you don't know how to make a roux, you're basically taking butter, melting it in a pan, and adding equal amounts of flour, and cooking that until it's a thick paste that turns a little bit brown. And if people want, we can do that in class, but there's lots of videos on YouTube of chefs making a roux. To use a roux, the fat and flour that's in here, and it's almost better to use a white flour than a whole wheat because it's not been fermented, right? So the white flour is much easier to digest. Or you could use spelt flour or chickpea flour if you wanted a gluten-free roux. And the only thing about using this is they have to be different temperatures. So if your soup is cold, you want a hot roux. If your soup is hot, you want a cold roux. If you put a hot roux in a hot soup, it's going to curdle. So I want to get this just a little warmer. I'm going to put the roux in, and that's going to thicken the soup a little because I found it a bit runny. We've got a broccoli vegetable soup. It has a bit of white beans, northern white beans in it, and some carrots. It's quite good. Emily and I had it yesterday when she was over, but it'll be even better today because it's always, that's what I like about soup. I'm not a big fan of leftovers, but soup I will eat, you know, even up to 3 days I'll eat soup. Hi, buddy. I fed you not too long ago. How's the temperature here?
Very.
Well, it's not hot enough yet. Well, I gave time for this to... And then we have a beet apple, our usual kind of beet apple salad with our apple cider vinegar dressing for even more probiotics, right? And this is such a great liver cleanser. So it's a wonderful addition to the diet. So we'll have a little bit of raw on the side. We'll have our sourdough bread. Hello. And our soup. Now, if this were to go a bit stale and get kind of hard and crusty, then it makes great croutons. So what people would have done with that bread after 3 or 4 days when there were no refrigerators, or people who don't like to refrigerate their sourdough, they would simply make bread pudding, they'd make croutons, put them in the soup. So those kinds of things would be how they would use it up. You don't want to put flaxseed in there.
No.
Because what happens with flaxseed when it sits in a wet environment? It gets like a jelly mess. It's actually an egg replacer. If you want to replace an egg in any recipe, take a tablespoon of flaxseed and put it in I think it's 1 tablespoon of water, and let it sit for a little while, and it will become this jelly kind of goop that will bind things together. So if you put flaxseed in here, it's not going to be good. It won't sprout like the other seeds will. Chia seed is very similar, right? If you ever use chia seed, how it gets all gelatinous and people make puddings out of it and stuff, you wouldn't want to put chia seed in here. If you were going to make a loaf of bread that you were going to put in the oven, like within, like a quick rise bread, maybe you could put chia seed in that because it's not sitting like this is for, 8 to 12 hours or 6 to 12 hours. So that's the difference there. But generally when they're using chia seeds and flaxseed, they're dehydrating, making crackers, that kind of thing, right? And then all that goopiness helps to bind the cracker together, but it dries out so that you're left with something crispy. Where if you put it in here, it would be bad news. But anything else, you could put some apricots in there. You could put mixed raisins in if you wanted. Any kind of seed. Probably smaller rather than bigger. Will be just fine. I've definitely used pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds. So if you're going to have like raw veggies now, you want it with something warming too. Like I'll have a bit of raw all winter long, but I wouldn't have like a great big raw salad for lunch in the middle of winter. The only people who would be doing that would be folks who are very, very hot. Or maybe they're on an anti-cancer diet, right? Then they're going to be doing salads, cleansing food all winter long. But winter's really for nourishing foods.
Yeah.